Hello everyone. It is my great pleasure to introduce the last panel of this conference. The chair of this panel is François Villeroy de Galhau, Governor of the Banque de France, and the chair of the Board of Directors of the BIS. François, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Louis. It's my privilege to chair this last panel, this high-level panel, at the end of a very interesting second Green Swan conference. We are lucky enough to have four very distinguished panelists. I don't need to introduce them in an elaborated and long manner. Yi Gang, President of the People Bank Republic of China, Christine Lagarde, President of the ECB, Roberto Campos Neto, Governor of the Central Bank of Brazil, and Agustín Carstens, General Manager of the BIS. I will be mainly a timekeeper, and so will try to be short myself. Just to say how we will proceed in this panel, which will last 90 minutes. We will have two rounds of discussion. The first one is, so to say, looking backward. Backward meaning since the first Green Swan conference 1 year ago. What did you do? What did your central bank do? What is your appreciation of the progress which has been made? To give a grain of salt, perhaps, on this theme, what also happened during this year was a comeback of inflation, so to say, which means that for all of us, except perhaps for Yi Gang, we had to refocus in some manner on our traditional mission of ensuring price stability. Did it hamper some progresses on climate? Did it change the way you worked on climate? It will be interesting to say. So this will be the first round. And each speaker will have about 6 minutes. Sorry to be precise, but my role is also to be the timekeeper, as I said. The second round will be to take the broader view and to look at other challenges, to look at other players, and to look, in some measure, at the future. Let me give some obvious examples. We have a fast-changing political and economic landscape with the shock of Ukraine. Is it a contradiction, or is it convergent with our action on climate change? We have very important question of cross-agency and international cooperation. And when I say cross-agency, what is the task of other public authorities, including governments? Let us take the example of carbon price. What can we do as central banks, and what is our limit, so to say? We have perhaps some risk of being overburdened. We will discuss about that. And to give a last question on this second broader round, the question of greenflation in the future, which has become much more significant, at least in the public debate, in the last 12 months. We will have to conclude a short wrap-up session where each of you will give perhaps his dream or wish or hope for the next future. So in order not to be too long, and I will sometimes add my own remarks, but at the end of the rounds, I suggest we go to your practical agenda, so to say, what you did in the last 12 months, what you are working on presently, and to start with Governor Yi Gang, if you agree, followed by Christine Lagarde, Roberto Campos Neto, and then Agustín Carstens. Yi Gang, the floor is yours if you agree, and again, welcome to all of you and to the whole audience.
Thank you, Francois. The People's Bank of China is delighted to co-host the second edition of Green Swan Conference. Building on the first conference, I think we first review what we have done since last year. Basically, I should say that we have done two things. First is People's Bank of China has conducted stress test. We conduct our first climate risk stress test on 23 major commercial banks in the second half of last year. And our test focus on the thermal power, steel industry, and also cement industry, and assessed the impact of the rising carbon prices on debt service ability of the three industry, and also the asset quality of the participation banks. The result shows that without a low carbon transition, the enterprises of these three industries would face a weakened capacity to service debts. However, since the loan provided by the banks to these three industries account for only a small share of the total, the aggregate capital adequacy ratio still met the regulatory requirements under all scenarios. Going forward, the People's Bank of China will continue to improve the methodology for climate risk stress test, and also extend the coverage from the three industry we have done last year to about 8 industry, to add some new industry in our stress test, such as petrochemical, chemical, non-ferrous metals, and paper making, and also aviation industries. We will also build a macroeconomic scenario by adopting the NGFS climate scenarios to the actual conditions in China. Our experience shows that the biggest challenge is insufficient information disclosure. Last year, the People's Bank of China released the guidance on environmental information disclosure for financial institutions, and has guided over 200 financial institutions to prepare environmental information disclosure reports. I think that's important, and including the procedures to identify, assess, manage, and control environmental risks, issuance of carbon emission reduction loans, and also the amount reduced emission, and also those information has to be verified by third-party agencies, so that to increase public confidence of those information. Going forward, we plan to expand our pilot program nationwide. The second tool we have done in the past year is that we introduced the central bank facility, which is a central bank relending program at a lower interest rate. Right now, the interest rate is 1.75, which is a cheaper financing resources to encourage the commercial bank to conduct green finance, and which I will continue to discuss in my second round discussion of what we are going to do in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yigang. It was a very good start, I must say, with much food for thought. And we'll probably come back to what you said, among others, on the information disclosure, which is a common challenge, and this facility lending, which is more Chinese specificity at this stage. Christine, can we turn to the ECB? Here, obviously, I have some insider's information, but I will follow with great interest your progress and our progress. Could I perhaps add again this grain of salt? How did the comeback of inflation disturb or not disturb your climate agenda? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francois. I think you'll be pleased with me when it comes to inflation, because I'm going to talk about that in the second round extensively, and you will have a lot in there. But let me first start by saying that the European Central Bank is really delighted to partner with the PBOC, with the BIS, with the NGFS, and I think that's BIS, PBOC, NGFS, that's right. And I think, Francois, it's a great topic that you have selected to sort of look back at what we talked about last year and what we have done and what's in the plan. So to have this accountability through the conference that Luis has been so critical in organizing, I think is a great discipline that we impose upon us. So if I look back since the last first Green Swan conference, for us at the European Central Bank and within the whole Euro system, 21 was a year of decision making. So in June, we opened the Climate Change Center, which harnesses capacities and try to coordinate the efforts undertaken by all national central banks of the Euro system. Second, we concluded during our strategy review that climate change was actually central bank relevant, if not critical. And third, we approved an action plan which covers year 22 to 24, which we are well advanced upon. So we have action items, a timetable to go with it, who does what, in a very organized and I think transparent and with great accountability about it. So let me point out the three areas where I think we have actually in 22, which I regard as a year of hard work, what we have actually achieved. First of all, on monetary policy, what we have done is integrate climate change risk in our macroeconomic modeling toolkit. We've also integrated climate change in our macroeconomic projections, and this is an ongoing process that we continuously improve upon. Second, we are currently assessing the actual validity of the credit rating that we are using to determine whether or not climate change risks are properly embedded by the credit rating agencies that we rely upon. And that is relevant both for the collateral assessment that we conduct on a regular basis, and it was also very effective when it comes to asset purchases. It will probably be less so as of such time when we stop doing net asset purchases, but it will continue to be relevant to the extent that we will reinvest at least for a period of time. And we are currently also exploring Eurosystem standards on climate change risks. And maybe we'll come back to this issue of the standards, because it's clearly an area where we need to agree with other institutions and we cannot conduct the work by ourselves. So that's for monetary policy. Just like Yigang, we have also done quite a lot of stress testing. We've done climate stress testing to assess the impact of climate change for banks and their clients. And we published the result of that work in September 21. It was a massive undertaking of a lot of data analysis. The essential conclusion of which was that not taking climate change seriously into account and running the risk of what we call the hothouse scenario increases the risk of bank failure by 8%. Second stress testing that we applied was a supervisory climate stress test, and the results will be published in July this year, and it covers all the systemic institutions that we cover. And finally, we're also working on the climate scenarios that are used by the NGFS that really serve as standards and to which we contribute. Third area of activities on the banking supervision. And here the climate and environment risk management, as well as disclosures, the two, are really considered as key priorities by the supervision activity throughout the system. Based on what we have seen so far, no bank is close to meeting the ECB's expectations when it comes to assessing, taking into account, disclosing the climate and environmental risks. 50% of banks have not planned concrete action to integrate climate and environmental risks in their strategy, and 75% of banks do not disclose if central and environmental risk have a material impact on their institution. Now, some of them will argue that this is a bit far-fetched, it's too much to ask, but we believe that actually indicating the numbers, not finger pointing, but calling upon the banks to actually take those matters seriously is critically important. This is in a nutshell what we've done this year. There's a lot in the pipeline that will be in the works in the course of 22 that will give deliverables in 23. Thank you, François.
Thank you very much, Christine. I liked your word accountability. We try in this panel to be accountable, not only to the audience, but to our fellow citizens of what we did. We spoke with very nice words last year, but we acted also. It's very important because there are some growing doubts among our fellow citizens. And we'll come back to this issue of standards, which you mentioned, which is probably linked to what Yigang said about disclosure. So we were lucky enough to have the view from Asia, a view from Asia, a view from Europe. Roberto, let us now go to America and Latin America, thanks to you. Please.
Well, thank you, François. Good day to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. So I guess I will start with your, grain of salt, which is what happens in a year that is so complicated as the year of 2021, since this is meant to be an update from the last Green Swan. And I think here we have good news because as opposed to what happens in the crisis of 2008, we see very little backtracking. And I think in terms of the culture of having to do the changes, it's much more ingrained in people's mind. There's a growing concern that sustainability, development, social environment risks are here to stay, and we need to deal with them. The society is demanding more and more from us, and it is showing in a lot of different actions in Brazil. The question is how to be in the frontier. And at the same time, the question is, the central bank is doing many other projects, is going back to the mandate, as you mentioned, with inflation, but more than that, is managing different credit programs that didn't exist in the past. We needed to create different lines during the crisis and the pandemic. And how do you deal with all that? And here, one thing that came to mind is we resisted the temptation of creating a green department. I think the idea of creating a green department for me was the idea that you have one department that's responsible for that, and the others will go back into doing their normal job. So I think it was very important to create that temptation to make sure that people understood that every department, every area of the bank is a green department, and the sustainability needs to be everywhere, and the culture needs to be everywhere. And then how can we set an example? I think the fact that Brazil is very, is very connected to the volatility of food prices, and we had many different climate events together with the pandemic, I think made the awareness grow in people's mind. So we had the agenda of the green agenda that was launched in 2020, September 2020. That was a 3-year program. I'm going to try to focus on what we did in the last year here. So we have the 5 different dimensions of the agenda: the internal policies, partnerships, policies, regulation and supervision. And And in that process, one thing that came out this time also, and I think it has to do with your grain of salt, is are we stepping out of our mandate here? As you start to see inflation going back higher and people concerns about some of the elements of sustainability, there was a lot of questioning of, are we stepping out of our mandate? And we had to decide that, what is the risk that we are going to take? We're risking of doing too much and being considered stepping out of your mandate, of the risk of doing too little and letting something very important pass by. And we decided that the risk of doing too much was a better one, even though there is some allegations or some indications from some market participants that we might be stepping out of our mandate. So going to what we did since then, in terms of internal policy, in September of 2021, we did our first report on social, environmental, and climate relating to risk and the opportunities. I think we were one of the first countries that released that. The report is very, very wide. It was very well done. We also had a report on the actions, and we used the report in an integrated manner. We looked for transparency and accountability. We also communicated the set of rules and practices that we want to see it done. We had an complete alignment with TCFD and GSF and the world organizations. On December 21st, we created finally the Committee on Sustainable Economy, which was having a horizontal view on everything that was being done in the central bank. We have like a control panel that we publish. It's on our website on everything that we have done. It's updated every week. We also included the sustainability criteria for managing reserves. That was very challenging because Brazil has a large amount of reserves and we needed to be transparent on that. In terms of supervision, on October 2021, we came up with a resolution of structuring and broadening the scope of collecting data on ESG. Collecting data, as was mentioned by others, is very challenging. We also tightened the requirements on remittance of information. We wanted to make sure that it's not only about disclosure, but the quality of the disclosure, comparability, if you can actually track the data, if you can trust the data, you can use the data. So we went and advanced on credit exposures, and we actually created some standards for monitoring the quality of data, which I think is still a challenge for us. In terms of regulation, on September 2021, after a long period of public consultation, we finally came out with the ESG risk management and policy guidelines. We extend regulatory requirements applicable to traditional risks to everything that was ESG and climate related. We established an integrated risk management approach, and we revised that. And we created our transparency and standardization of reports. We wanted to make sure that everything was comparable and it was standardized. In terms of the main projects being executed, I think our main project, and I think it's a pilot of a lot of things, and it's very particular of Brazil, is what we call our Green Bureau, which basically defines the sustainability criteria applicable to all the rural credit, all the agro credits. And in a way, it's the beginning of a taxonomy, because when you start creating rules for loans on the agro part, in a way, you are actually touching a little bit the space of the taxonomy. And we thought, as I said, this program is a pilot for many things, so we thought this was a bit of a pilot for taxonomy. It's also being used as a tool for risk management by financial institutions. Now the Green Bureau is actually considered a big step for development of green bonds and securitization. We started to see the banks using that as a tool. It's guided by a principle of open finance, which is a project that is underway in Brazil and is very advanced. So the sharing of information can be done without the intermediation of financial institutions, which actually has improved a lot. And we are seeing in terms of information on the agro production that we started to see this information flowing very well. So the goal at the end is to have better ability to price assets and to allocate resources and the flow of credit. So the Green Bureau is actually advanced and is actually hitting its objectives. And the second main project is the climate and stress testing. On this, the Central Bank of Brazil is improving on the monitoring climate risks and stress test. In 2022, we will complete the incorporation of all the risk scenarios arising from climate changes. We will incorporate the risks not only from physical and transitory risk, but we are going to have this integrated approach, will be very transparent, and we will monitor, identify, and report the threats to financial stability. As a conclusion, I would say that, again, this time is different. We think even though we had the inflation problem and a lot of questions, we think we are actually going to achieve more meaningful results. We had a big debate on how we make sure that everything that we've done has measurable results. There's a trade-off between the short term and the long term. You want, for example, the stress test to start having impact in the short term, but you don't want it to be done in an organized way. So I think there's a lot of trade-offs on what you do. And as was mentioned, some of the banks complain that it's too much to disclosure in a very short term of time, that they need to, to go back and do the policies. We are guided by international practices. And the question continues to be, how can we be in the frontier of these ESG policies in a field of constant revolution? Perhaps, a thought for the future would be, are we doing this right? Is there anything that we can be doing, that we could be doing that will accelerate the process? And the 2 points that come to mind is, I think the way we use data and the way we monetize data, and the Green Bureau has taught us that actually with the open finance concept, you can actually monetize data on green credit in a much better way. And also, if we are using the data in the correct way, if it's comparable, if the disclosure is being done, and I think here we could be using more EI to perfect the conclusions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roberto. You mentioned again the issue of data. We'll come back to it. You mentioned also the debate about our mandate. Are we in the right place, or do we do too much or too little? And this is a very difficult question. We'll come back to it. Agustín, you will give us the global view and also the BIS view, what the BIS is doing on these key topics. Please.
Thank you very much, Francois. And it's a real pleasure to be in this panel with the very distinguished board members from the BIS, including its chairman. The BIS owes itself to the central banking community, and certainly we take our marching orders from the central banks. And needless to say, during the last years, we have gotten very clear indication that it is important for the central banking community to enhance our work in green finance. And in this way, obviously, this issue has been incorporated in our working agenda in a very agile fashion. And one proof is this conference organized primarily by my deputy, Luis Pereira. But obviously, we are here, as I mentioned, to complement and to support the efforts of the central banking community in terms of for them to be able to have a more decisive impact on the issue of climate change. And during the last year, we have worked in many different aspects, but I will give two very precise examples of what we have been doing in line with what I just said. One of the major areas of activity of the BIS is precisely for us to support the efforts of central banks to manage adequately and efficiently their international reserves. We have noticed that many central bank reserve managers, like many private investors, are seeking opportunities to invest in securities aligned with the objectives of the Paris Accord. But in conversations with them, we have heard that often they find it difficult to locate securities that that comply with these objectives of the Paris Accord, and at the same time they meet the criteria of liquidity and safety. So we saw here an opportunity not only for us to enhance our banking operation, but also to pitch into the global effort towards the combat to climate change. And in this year, last year, we focused in Asia. It is clearly that the green infrastructure needs in emerging markets in Asia are huge. Developing Asia alone needs around 1.7 trillion per year into infrastructure investment, much of which should go into green investment. At the same time, Asia has pretty much the largest pool of foreign exchange reserves, around 5.7 trillion at the end of 2019, and probably we're still around those levels. Therefore, our objective was to bring these two aspects together and basically to facilitate the channeling of resources from international reserves towards financing some of the green infrastructure investment that is required. And to comply with this, we decided to launch a new open-ended U.S. Green Bond Fund, which is dedicated to help channel central bank reserves precisely to finance investments in green projects in the Asia-Pacific region. This complements two other open-ended funds that we operate, one in euros, the other in dollars. And we try to do this in a way that we can also sort of push the line or the barriers in terms of the challenges that we face towards channeling investments to these purposes. We try to apply the best standards, the best criteria. Needless to say, for the management of international reserves, a minimum rating is required. We look after that. We invest in bonds that observe strict international standards, either by the International Capital Market Association's Green Bond Principles and or the Climate Bond Standard that is published by the Climate Bond Initiative. Our expectation is that the funds will continue to grow as reserve managements continue to beef up their sustainable investment practices. We will certainly complementing this with meaningful reporting so that we have impact reporting, which needless to say is an essential complement to assure those investors that the final objective of the vehicle is being complied with. So we see this as a growing business opportunity, and it's a win-win because we allow banks, central banks, to comply duly with their mandate of promoting green finance, at the same time doing in a safe way according to their mandates, according to whatever is there the international reserves for, namely liquidity. We also, as at least my four other fellow panelists know, the VIS have been working a lot on innovation and digitalization through the VIS Innovation Hub, and also by the insistence of the board, we have in the hub include in a very active way the green agenda. And in this respect, we have developed a very successful project that we call it Project Genesis, that we carried on in cooperation primarily with the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, that basically makes it possible in real time monitoring the environmental performance of investments that are done with the objective of green finance. So, I mean, as it is key, and I will come back to this later, one of the huge challenges in green finance is precisely how to intermediate the best savings to green investments. For that, data is essential, and for many investors are becoming more and more time, as time passes, more and more demanding on the quality of data they have, and what is this incorporated into the instruments they invest in. So it is critical in the projects to integrate real-time tracking and disclosure of green or related outcomes, such as carbon emissions, for investors. And this, in this project Genesis, can be done in mobile apps by tokenizing the investment and also make it available for retail investors. So this has been a great instrument to make more available investment opportunities to the population, enhancing dramatically transparency, following in a way the principle that last year Al Gore expressed in the Green Conference of the need to implement a radical transparency. So I'll stop here, Francois. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Agustin. It was slightly more than 6 minutes, but very practical and concrete examples and actions. Just to complement very quickly, because I am also subject to accountability with the Banque de France. What we did in the last year in the 3 fields mentioned, for example, by Christine, on the macroeconomics of climate and modeling, which is for me absolutely key. As we know, we have in the Banque de France the Global Secretariat of the NGFS. So I precise today our commitment. We will publish with the NGFS, and you were kind enough to mention the NGFS scenario. We will publish an update of our 6 macro-financial scenarios by next July, incorporated the last IPCC physical scenarios. And I strongly hope it's a common grammar for all of us. Second, on disclosure, we were the first central bank to join the so-called CDP Carbon Disclosure Program with many large corporates, and it's a strong commitment for us. And we put pressure on our banks and financial institutions in order to have better and more consistent disclosure. And last, I will not comment on monetary policy because obviously we are part of the ECB policy. I add one word on our non-monetary portfolio. We were the first central bank to commit and to publish 3 years ago the alignment of our equity and pension system portfolio to 2 degrees. We commit to come in the next month to 1.5 degree. And this last mile is very difficult to conclude. And we commit, in the spirit of what Agustin said, to extend our green commitments not only to our own equity, but to all our reserves, non-monetary portfolio. So we commit, and we do it already, to reinvest 20% of all our scheduled bonds. 20% of our reinvestment in each currency is now in green bonds. And this is also very committing. Can I perhaps take 2 quick questions from what you said and invite you to react in 1 minute, if I may? First, about disclosure and standardization. Each of you has probably domestic standards or will have domestic standards. I know best the European case. How do you see the conciliation with international standardization? Do you welcome the ISSB work? And how will you implement, so to say, a double standardization, the local or regional one and the international one? And we all know that this is a very hot question. And Yigang, I would start with you on this question. And second, about the mandate, and here Roberto mentioned it, we are always torn apart, so to say, for probably a significant part of our fellow citizens. We are too slow. I participated yesterday evening in a citizens event. I was under pressure to go quicker, go stronger. But on the other side, economists, politicians, perhaps more in Brazil than elsewhere, but criticize, or in the US, criticize us to say you shouldn't care about climate, you should be focused on inflation. I will take a very practical example. Yigang, you mentioned the green lending facility of PBOC. You are probably the one who has the broadest mandate, who goes much further. Christine, I know the answer because we had this debate, but did the ECB consider a green lending facility? If not, why, etc.? It's a good example of how far we can go or we shouldn't go. So if you agree, I give the floor 1 minute to each of you, not more. You choose among these two questions or 30 seconds for each of one. Yigang, to start with.
Okay, thank you. I choose on the standard question. I think right now we have the domestic standard. We have working with NDRC and CSRC to set up the domestic standard. But we are also working with U.S. Treasury for the G20 standard, and also work with the European Commission for the common ground taxonomy. I think in the future, I prefer that we have to gradually converge domestic standard to international standard in order to have a more efficient communication. Thank you.
Thank you, Yigang. Christine?
Yeah, thank you very much, Francois. Very quickly, first of all, I think that Emmanuel Faber, who is heading the effort on the ISSB, has done a fantastic job, has moved super fast. The ISSB is now up for consultation. It went as fast as the SEC with Gary Gensler. So these two gentlemen are really driving the show fast, and it's good. I'm not sure that there is that much consistency between the SEC standards and the ISSB, which are related to the IFRS. But my hope, and it's a hope, I would have put it in my last section of how you structured the conference, Francois, but my hope is that the ISSB standards, which borrow from the TCFD, which have been broadly accepted by the private sector and by a lot of corporates as good standards, I hope that this ISSB will be the reference, will be the standards. The US is not going to accept it. We know that already. They're going to play with their own standards. Japan is not going to accept it exactly either. But if it can at least be used as guidance, and some of us will use it, some of us certainly in Europe will want to do an even better job, be more sophisticated, be more intricate and all the rest of it. But I really hope that we have as much convergence as possible with ISSB as the reference. And I'm delighted to hear that Yigang is also looking at that with interest, as he does with the taxonomy that the European Parliament has approved. So we have now a taxonomy, we have the ISSB in Europe. We are going to have something probably a bit more sophisticated when it comes to that, but hopefully it will be consistent. And on the issue of which you have the answer, Francois, super fast, green lending facilities, it was not in the cards a year ago. I'm not giving up on that. Japan is looking at it, China is doing it. Why wouldn't we have an open mind about it? I know it's not squarely in the mandate and it's not necessarily in what we consider as the prime objective, but you know, if we don't try, then we have no chance of succeeding. So count on me.
Thank you. Sorry for disturbing the order of the agenda, but thank you for having shared with us already your hope on standardization. Roberto.
No, thank you. Very quick, Francois. On the international practices, I think we need to converge. So the question is how fast and what is the process of convergence? And here I would say processes related to industry are much easier than the ones related to agriculture, because Brazil is very big in agriculture and the way we set the limits for production and things like that are a bit more challenged, but we need to commit to have a convergence to the international practices. On the mandate, just a comment that sometimes the challenge is much more from the productive side, from the ones being influenced, than from the politicians themselves. I think by and large in Brazil, the politicians understand that we need to go further with that, and we have a full support on that. And the last comment on the lending facility, we do have the Green Bureau. It's not a lending facility, but it's like a bureau which works as a lending facility. But we are also studying We have a line in which we give liquidity to banks in exchange for private credit. If we should have, a bit of a twist on that to make sure we have a green side or a green facility within that line. Thank you.
Thank you, Agustin.
Thank you, Francois. I'll give some of the time I took in excess back. Just a very quick words. We fully support all the work on standardization. Here in this building, in the BIS, a lot of work is being done, not only by us, but also by the FSB that is hosted here, by the Basel Committee. So we fully support that. And in terms of the mandate, I think I certainly see the appetite of all central banks to definitely pitch in very enthusiastically on the agenda of climate change. But I just see the issue as a major effort that each country will have to solve between priorities and adequate instruments to deal the different objectives that central banks have. It's a difficult equation to square, but certainly I see that the best of intentions in all our members. Thank you.
So thanks to each of you. We now come to the second half. We are a bit late, but my fault, but it was really interesting. So the second half is about the broader view or the bigger picture. Let me only mention some challenges which are on the table. First, Ukraine and the geopolitical landscape. Does it lead to a short-term contradiction, at least, between energy crisis and climate change? And does it make international cooperation more difficult? Or how can we deal with the increased difficulty of international cooperation? Then we have the issue of what we call cross-agency. How can we convince, or what can we expect from other public authorities to do their job, and not only ours, including carbon price, to give an example. And third, there could be other points, but I will stop there. This rising question about greenflation, and Christine will say some words about that. Can I ask that each of you, if possible, sticks again to 6 minutes in order for us to keep on time? Here, we will have Christine, then Yegang, Agustin, and Roberto to change a bit. Christine. We cannot hear you.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute. You want me to tackle the greenflation first, or shall I say 2 words on this?
Everything together, if you agree. But you choose your priorities.
Okay, just a quick comment on your first questions. International cooperation, what we see as badly needed. So it is highly desirable, both in relation to standardization, harmonization, how we measure, how we disclose, and how and when we agree on carbon price path. That would be highly desirable. Not sure that we're going to get there, but necessary. Second, where cooperation is badly needed is between the public and the private sector. We know that massive financing is going to be needed if we want to reach the objective of the Paris Agreement. And for that, the public sector will not suffice, and there has to be cooperation between the two of them. Third, we also know that 50% of the technologies that will be needed in order to reach the objectives of the Paris Agreement and to fight climate change and protect biodiversity and the environment are yet to be invented. It's not on the table yet. And for that, public and private sector will also have to cooperate and to stir this innovation that is going to be so critical. So let me now move to this issue of greenflation. And I like to think about those issues using time distribution. In the short term, greenflation is not the issue. In the short term, we have fossil inflation as a big issue. We have foodflation as a big issue. We have inflation altogether as a big issue that we have to tackle. But it's not greenflation in the short term. The real impact that we are suffering is not green, it's fossil inflation. And if we look at, for instance, the latest readings that you're very familiar with, Francois, energy is more than 39% higher in terms of prices than it was a year ago, and a massive contributor to the high inflation numbers that we have at the moment. If we look at the components that we use in order to bring about green energies, whether you look at solar panel, whether you look at the wind turbine equipment, all those prices have gone down regularly, and that was a trend. It has slightly reversed and changed a bit in the last year because of scarcity of supply and the bottlenecks, but very mildly, and the contribution of greenflation is absolutely minimal. The real problem that we have is the dependency on a small and sometimes hostile number of suppliers of fossil energies at the moment. Now, this issue is also going to come back to haunt us in what I would now turn to, which is the medium term. So in the medium term, cost pressure related to the green transition will certainly be stronger, and it will be related to the decarbonization as well as the transition. What would be the sources? Source number one, if we have ambitious transition goal, which we should have, because listening to Timmermans or listening to Al Gore in the last few days, we know that we are behind schedule. We know that we are going to heat at a much higher pace than the 1.5% or even the 1.8%. We are on a trend at a 4% at the moment if nothing gets done. So we will probably need to have more ambitious transition goals, and that will lead to higher carbon pricing. Second, we will probably have a higher demand for minerals, for metals that are badly needed for some of the sectors that will promote a more environmental friendly environment. That is certainly the case for the automotive industry. Electric cars, for instance, consume 50% more metal and minerals that are in rare availability than conventional cars. And here again, we must absolutely avoid the risk that we are facing now with fossil energies, which is to rely on a small, maybe friendly, but maybe not so friendly list of suppliers. And we need to be very cautious in planning the transition. Third source is that there will probably be less investment in fossil fuel, whether it is exploring, refining, or transporting. And as a result of that, because demand will continue to be relatively high, we are also going to see pressure on prices in that respect, because demand will be stronger than supply. If you look at the IAE, for instance, their numbers are eloquent in that respect. Again, medium term, technology will be absolutely key, and the best energy that we will have will be the energy that we will save during that medium term. Final, in my chronology, in the long term, most likely from the literature that has already been published, and the research department of the ECB is doing its share, and my good colleague Isabel Schnabel has given a very good speech on those issues. Most likely, renewable energy capacity will expand over the long term, and as a result, price will reduce, and we will have lower inflation pressure going forward. Now, obviously, that is going to take the two preceding steps of short and medium term before we get there. We will be publishing in the next economic review that the ECB publishes a very large survey of corporates on those particular topics, and a study that we have conducted on that basis. And it's quite interesting how they see that the transition will indeed be inflationary in the medium term, but they also see massive room for opportunities of their business, of their innovation, and of the transformation that they will be subject to. So those are the points that I wanted to identify. And I would finish by mentioning that all this that we are saying, all the conclusions that we are drawing, and all the efforts that we make to understand how inflationary or disinflationary those trends will be, it is very difficult to study, because it depends on multiple factors, policy decisions, evolution, geopolitical matters, which are quite difficult to factor in. But I think it's our duty to do so. And bottom line, we also know that there is urgency in moving with this transition, the cost of which, inflationary or deflationary, will in any case be dwarfed by the cost of not acting and of letting this unabated climate change consequences play out in probably shorter order than we think. Thank you, François.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you for what you said about the time distribution. It's very enlightening. And thank you for this new word, which is fossilflation. It's the first time I can hear it. Greenflation appeared since the first Green Swan conference, but fossilflation appeared today, so to say. Yigang, now the floor is yours. You choose again, but if you could say especially some words on international cooperation, your view will be absolutely key.
Thank you. I think for central bank mandate, price stability is first. As far as when we make the monetary policy in terms of aggregate monetary policy, interest rate, money supply, so that we have to maintain price stability. That's number one. At the same time, People's Bank of China also advocating for climate transition nationwide, which means that you can, at the same time, doing some structural policies to promote green finance. I think we can do it because, as I said, that first we have to do the stress test, and then we have to have information disclosure policy. And in our approach is we will ask the major commercial banks, which account for a large percent of the market share, to have a quarterly report on the information of climate change related informations. And then if they have the report, for the central bank, you can measure their performance and give them a performance rating, which is a score, and make the entire commercial bank community and financial market community aware of the importance of green finance. So if you have this measurement, and the central bank, you can give some encouragement. You see, as far as the regulation and the punishment are concerned, you can consider it later. But right now, we first have the encouragement incentive policy first, which means that we have this facility, green relending facility, to encourage the commercial bank to do it. We already lend out something like more than 160 billion renminbi green facility from the relending program of the central bank. We will do more. And when we do more, we will encourage the commercial bank continue to meet the disclosure criteria and have a higher and higher quality of disclosure, and that solve the data problem and the measurement problem, and make this the climate transition be more efficient. Lastly, about the international cooperation. Certainly, I think it is very important for international cooperation. We continue to work with our European colleagues, European Commission. I think right now, in our discussion of the taxonomies, we have about 80% convergence already, so that we will continue to work on that. And you see, finally, our final goal is, is that the more converged and the more, reach the goal of international taxonomy, and then the communication and the carbon pricing and the carbon market will be more efficient. So in terms of the G20 ground, we will continue to work with the U.S. Treasury to have the Sustainable Finance Working Group work. We have a framework, and we will steadily push forward the work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Higa. May I ask a question? I should know, but frankly, I don't know. Where is at present China on carbon price? Does it consider introducing it or raising it? I should know, but...
So far, we already have a carbon price market, but it's a limited market. Only have the basically the coal power generating, electricity generating enterprises in that market. So that in the future, we are going to have more industry participate in the market, and also we have financial industry participate at the carbon pricing market. That's the current undergoing work we are doing. Thank you.
Thank you. We now come to Agustín and Roberto. May I ask you perhaps mainly to react to what Christine and Yigang said very interestingly on these various topics. You can introduce obviously your own ideas, but it's interesting to have your reactions in about 5 minutes. Agustín.
Thank you very much, Francois. I mean, the analysis that Christine made on greenflation and the different timeline, I fully agree with it. So I don't want to dwell too much on it because I fully coincide with the framing of the issues. And let me just say on international cooperation that there is an area where, you know, the BIS is very well placed to do this. And let me build a little bit on the example I gave in my first intervention about our Asian Green Bond initiative. And it is, I mean, our job to a large extent is to be able to channel savings to green investments. And in terms of international reserve management, one of the challenges we face, as I hinted, is the lack of sufficient adequate supply of instruments in which to invest that comply with liquidity and credit worthiness and adequate information. So to enhance the pool of investable securities in the Asia region, a very, very concrete but very promising initiative that we have undertaken is to enhance our dialogue with the Asian Development Bank. They have the advantage of, let me put it in this way, having boots on the ground, and they have the ability to generate green projects in areas such as renewable energy production or energy efficiency, also to facilitate the transition, the different transition aspects that we will face. And I think this way of trying to bring supply and demand is really, really promising. So I have to say that that is an area of cooperation where, you know, you have an institution like the BIS that is on the investment side. They have the issue of the Asian Development Bank that is basically to create projects. So it's good to bring the two sides together, talk to each other, and hopefully this will promote many more projects. Lastly, I think that the BIS also has a great comparative advantage to dwell on something that is essential in all these processes, and that is data. I think that the collection of data is not always cheap, it's not always efficient. We need a lot of international collaboration, and we have geared some of our to precisely provide much better data. The Irving Fisher Committee that many of you know very well is devoted to this, and the BIS has built different databases that, in particular in green bonds, that certainly has become very important. We are chairing the International Working Group on Security Databases, and even the International Association of Insurance Supervisions that we host here at the BIS, is undertaking members surveys on best practices and scenario analysis on having a better quantitative data collection on global insurance sector's exposures to climate risk. So we're working in these different aspects of international cooperation, and I see a very, very fruitful engagement, and it's a very promising field as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Agustin, Roberto, about your reaction.
Thank you, Francois. Well, I'll start, I think, with the reaction to what Christine said, which is the green inflation and the fossil inflation. And I think at the end, what I see is that the green inflation will become and is becoming an impediment to improve fossil inflation in the future. And the channel in which this works is mainly technology. The technology to make sure that we have less fossil inflation will require a lot of elements that are today subject to green inflation. And I think the pendulum swings a lot. I remember, and we've been talking about green inflation in the central bank in Brazil from the early 20s. And I remember one of the conferences that we had at the BIS, and I mentioned one example in which I thought the pendulum was very restrictive, which was I talked to nuclear guys and some people doing fertilizers, and the report that they were giving me is that it's very hard for us to get funding these days, because to raise money through market instruments, nuclear power was not seen as something very sustainable at the time, which I kind of disagree, but I mean still. And also the banks don't want to give me lending because they're telling me it's going to cost more capital. So I think it became it's been with us for a while. I think the pendulum swing was very restrictive. Now I think it's more going back to a more understandable policy. One of the things is who is paying for the price of emission, and that was also present in the debate of green inflation all the time. We are seeing at some point in time before the war and going into the beginning of the pandemic that we are seeing some factories or some rare earths or some lithium and cobalt plants being shut down, because the reality is to achieve the transition, the elements that are needed to do that are not very green by nature, the production of them. Actually, 40% of the things that are used into this technology innovation to produce the transition were produced in not very sustainable ways. And the third point was the sharing of the cost through the production chain. So I think at the end, it's difficult to separate. I think the timeline example was great because this is more or less the way I think will become relevant. But we had this green inflation coming from the past, and I think we had the funding problem, we had the sharing of cost problem, and then we collided that with a master problem, a huge problem in supply, and then we are at a situation today that I think a lot of things are giving us red signs. When we look at energy, we have higher prices and very low capex. When you look at the difference between the price of oil and the price of derivatives, there's red signs all over the place. When you look at the price of food and the capex on processing food, there is also a red line. And the reality is, I open the paper every day and there is a news from some country that are adopting some kind of protectionism on food, on energy, or restricting export of this and that. And I think this is creating this huge uncertainty in investment. And I think this will exacerbate the problem. I think these non-linear policies done by individual countries in a desperate move to make sure that they have food and energy security at their own country, but in an uncoordinated way is adding to fossil inflation and to green inflation at the same time. So I think we are facing some possible setbacks on that. When I look at energy and food and compare the capex with prices and everything that I see, I think in the case of energy, it will be fixed sooner. I think energy will be, it's my view that we're actually going to have alternative resources accelerating. The opportunity cost is raising a lot of investment for alternative solutions. So energy, I think, probably will be solved sooner. The food becomes, I think, more worrisome for me, because I think in the terms of the food chain and all the global chain reaction that we are seeing, and the global value chain changes that we are seeing, the problem of actually doing this in a sustainable way, remembering that nearshoring and friendshoring are not very efficient in consuming energy. We actually have reports that this new way of doing global value chains will consume much more energy, will be much less efficient. We are seeing that in the production of many items. So I think, how can we make this efficient? I think that's the question at the end. I mean, we have this blend of fossil inflation, green inflation. How can we make that efficient, the transition efficient? I think we need to improve pricing mechanisms. Carbon pricing is an excellent example. I think it solves some of the problem of the dilemma between emerging market and developed markets on how to do that and how to price and how to prioritize. I think better data collection, as mentioned by Agustín, is a very good example of how we can centralize this and organize. And I'll make an example of Brazil, because I think it's a reality of many countries. We have a blend of green inflation, fossil inflation, and we are the case of a commodity producer. So let's stop and think what happens. Well, on one side, we have a very positive shock, right? We have better terms of trade. Income is rising. We have tax collections going to the roof. Actually, there's some people now doing calculations on how much this is improving our GDP, and we are one of the few countries that are being revised up the GDP. But on the other side of that, we have a huge social cost. Food prices is increasing, energy prices is increasing, and we have the lower part of the population that's really in need of some assistance. So we have a positive shock on one side and a negative social shock on the other side. How to deal with that? And I think that's the question that I think deserves a lot of attention. You can do three things. You can be, very liberal and practical and say prices will dictate equilibrium. At some point in time, the price will rise, consumption will go lower, and at the end, people will adapt. That is not sociable viable, and it's not politically viable either. The second option is I can intervene in prices, and I see that in many countries. So I will intervene in prices, I will intervene in the process of producing oil, of producing electricity, and that will fix the problem in the short term, but will discourage investment. And at the end, I think the private sector is the one who's going to solve the problem, not the governments. And you can do the third solution, which is I'm going to take some of this positive shock and I'll transfer the positive shock to fix the social issues through subsidies. And this is a good solution, but the problem is once you create a subsidy, you have the risk of becoming a permanent expenditures. So at the end, I think dealing with this problem, for example, in our case, being a commodity producer, I think is at the key of the decision, and that's going to influence the way we look to this in the future. Just to end, I think I've used all my time. I think yes. Coordination is key, and we need to make sure that we share the cost burden so that we can optimize this transition. And I think energy security and renewables can advance in a much sustainable way. And the fact that opportunity costs are increasing, generate a lot of different investments. We are seeing this in Brazil. And so I think we should not be so gloomy. I think part of the crisis will actually bear positive results in the long end. Thank you. Sorry about the time.
No, thank you, Roberto. And I will follow up what you just said. I will abuse my privilege as chair because the advantage is that I'm completely free, so I can put on the table very simplistic questions. I will put one for each of you. And Agustín, I would like to have your answer first because you are the global and neutral authority. My simplistic question would be following. Is the war in Ukraine regarding our fight against climate change, A, an accelerator, B, a brake, or C, broadly neutral? Or to put my simplistic question in a somewhat more sophisticated way, how can we make the war, this awful war in Ukraine, an opportunity for the fight against climate change? The question is simple, but Agustín, we will listen to your answer with great interest.
Well, thank you very much, Francois. I mean, I think the war in the Ukraine is a big wake-up call. I mean, I think that we have been guided too much by efficiency principles in terms of how key inputs are supplied to the world, how do we build the value chains. And you know, there are some tail risks that are there that we tend probably to minimize usually, but when they materialize, they generate huge problems. I think we have a vulnerability of resilience of the world economy, and I certainly we need to think about it. Obviously, countries need to evaluate their vulnerabilities and diversify accordingly. And if you diversify, it's very likely that the pressures on inflation and the pressures on climate will be differentiated. So I think as there is this common phrase that is used frequently, we should take advantage of every single crisis to look for a better world. And I think this is a big opportunity.
Muchas gracias. Can I turn to Christine or Yigang? I don't know who wants to try to answer first my simplistic question. Yigang, Christine.
Okay, well, definitely an accelerator, Francois, and I think that it will push all of us to move from a focus on efficiency to incorporating security, from dependency to diversification, and from this largely and predominantly fossil fuel policy mix to something that will be much more mixed and much less fossil. I would like to correct one thing, Francois, if I may, because I was speaking from memory and I had to check my notes. And I was comparing, remember, the electric car and the conventional car. And actually, the electric car uses over 6 times more minerals than conventional cars, hence the risk of dependency depending on the source of the minerals. Thank you.
So the first part of your answers was definitely good news. The second part less so, but it was less important. But thank you. Yigang.
We are going to have our green transition in any case. I think right now we should take this moment and to reorganize our policy priorities and to make our green transition more efficient and sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto. Would you like to add something to what you said already?
I'll pay back my time. I'm just gonna say I think it's definitely an accelerator, and I think it presents challenges but also opportunities, as I think I have already stated. Thank you.
Okay. If I try to give my own answer to my simplistic question, I would probably tend to use the time distribution which Christine used earlier. In the middle and long run, I agree it's an accelerator. In the short run, frankly, there could be some contradiction and some break. And when I see my fellow citizens, at least, are focused on this question of lower energy prices, purchasing power, etc. So we need at least to explain that it is consistent with the fight against climate change, because there is a risk of short-term contradiction, at least as I see it in my country. Okay, if you agree, we come to the last part, the shortest one, but the most promising one, because I will invite each of you to look to the future, which, by the way, you already did, and I thank you for all the insightful thoughts you brought on the table. But if you look to your agenda, we spoke about your agenda for the last 12 months, but if you look at your agenda for the next 12 months, the top priorities, the must-do, so to say, what would you say? And this is a word also I used at the start, which is about your hopes. The main challenge is that each of you has a bit more than 2 minutes to choose among all the priorities of the future. Christine, would you be ready to start?
Okay. I start from the premise that time is of the essence. We cannot waste it. It's critically important that we move fast. I have four wishes for next year. First of all, I would like to see disclosures that are harmonized, that have converged, that can be audited, and that can be transparent. That's number one. Number two, looking just at my area at the moment, which is Europe, that we have a green capital market union that is operable and functioning and feeding the liquidity and the capital that is needed by the private sector so badly. Third, I would explore, and I hope we do not spend too much time debating it, and I'm sure that you will be on my side, François. I would hope that we can produce a page from the book of Yigang or from the book of Kuroda that would help us with the financing of a green project with a targeted lending mechanism. And fourth, which is a bit more innovative and which I'm not sure we have the competence to do that. We're not necessarily driving that bus, but there are here and there now literature and studies that are produced that base sequestration of carbon on the use and the promotion of nature-based solution. And if you will, you provide a solution that deals with two problems. You protect biodiversity better, and you deal with carbon sequestration. I will not bore you with the examples of the whales, the examples of the elephant. The dolphins are the next in line, and we have to be able to produce a financial instrument that helps produce those nature-based solutions to sequester carbon. Those were my four. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yigang, please.
Thank you. I think our discussion indicate whether green transition is inflationary or not. This is a question. I think it may be. However, when we have the technology innovation very rapidly, we can rapidly reduce the green premium. As far as the central banker is concerned, I think we can consider the aggregate problem and the structural problem at the same time. Aggregate problem meaning that we have to maintain price stability, whereas the structural problem is that wherever we can facilitate the green transition. The key variable here is carbon price, so that in the future, I think we will work on the build-up of the carbon price market and to have more institutions participate in the market and reflecting the carbon price so that we have a better measure of disclosure information, make the incentive to be right, and the whole society be aware of the advantage of green transition and make the public opinion, public awareness of the advantage of green transition. That is our key work for next year. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I suggest Roberto and Agustin give also their view. If I have 2 minutes left at the end, I will give mine. But Roberto, please.
I'll continue to pay back my time to you, François. Oh. So my wish list has 4 things, very, very fast. Taxonomies, especially for Brazil, we need to advance on that. At the end, the central bank will probably be responsible for leading this project, and we are putting a study group to advance on that. Carbon markets, as was mentioned by Yigang, and I think the carbon market is the perfect way, the only way to allocate resources efficiently and to bring the society into this stage of awareness of what's happening. And I think it's going to connect funds in a more efficient way. The third one is a better use of technology in the green transition. I think at the end, we're going to be looking from the future to today and saying the main responsible for actually achieving that was reorganizing the way we use technology for this transition. And then the last wish, I think, is more related to Brazil, is we need to find a way to monetize native forest. We need to find a way in which we can actually extract value from that This is not being solved yet. It's very asymmetrical, the incentives to actually to plant a tree and to preserve a tree. And I think we need, as a society, globally to find a solution for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The agenda is already very rich after 6 minutes, but Agustín, you will complete it.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Francois. The magic number in this section of the panel is 4. I also have 4 areas where we will be working mostly towards supporting central bank work in green finance and also build up market infrastructure in the financial system. First, macro financial modeling, it's essential. Data, technological innovation through the hub, and banking. And banking products and facilitate investment of international reserves. And my hope is that we will continue moving in the direction that climate change issues are more and more less of an afterthought in finance. It has to be embedded in the way we approach finance.
Thank you. I will personally also use the magic 4, as you just said. It's by chains. But I would see on my side and on NGFS side 3 priorities which are up, which depend on us, and the 4th one which doesn't depend fully on us. First is, as you just said, Agustín, green modeling, or what I call the macroeconomy of climate. I hope we can make decisive breakthrough in the year to come, and NGFS scenarios will help. Second, about financing, Christine, can I quote you in another opportunity about, at least in the European environment, what we call a green capital market union? We have many private resources, private savings in excess. We should find a way to channel them towards green investment. It looks obvious, but we are not yet there. And at least in our case, there are too many borders, be they geographical, or be they midterm, long-term, or be they type of financial assets. Third, and it's also significantly on us, is green standardization. And it joins what several of you said on data. We should have better collection, true, but if we collect data which are not harmonized and comparable, they will not be very useful. So I strongly hope we can make a breakthrough in the next year. I said 3 plus 1 because the last one is carbon price. And yes, carbon markets, as Yigang and Roberto mentioned, but as much as possible, international. It will be the most difficult challenge. It's mainly on governments. It's difficult with public opinions. It's difficult because do we need carbon border adjustment mechanism to be seen? There is this idea of a club. There is this idea by the IMF of a floor carbon price with different floors according to the level of development of each region to be seen. But I am a bit worried that as carbon price is the most difficult question, economists remind us that it's the most efficient one. But if we don't take this difficult road, we will not succeed. So I think we should put pressure, at least repeat and repeat that it's necessary. So if there is no other reaction, as we are 2 minutes before the end, can I thank you warmly? Yigang, please.
Yeah, I just want to give Agustín answer that for the reserve management, China has a large foreign exchange reserve. I think our policy is have a green ESG policy on the reserve management to invest more on green bond and green project. That's definitely our policy, and we have large potential. And I think Agustín mentioned this is very important. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. 谢谢, you say in Chinese, no?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
谢谢.
I am making progress in Chinese. Thank you. I will not conclude, but before giving the last word to Luis, let me stress perhaps one thing, which is for me a very important and encouraging message of this high-level panel. Obviously, the last months have been very difficult. And we have seen the comeback of inflation. We have seen strong geopolitical tensions, to say the least. We have seen the war. We have seen energy and, yes, Roberto, food crisis. But what each of you said is that your energy, your commitment, our energy, our commitment, including the ones of the central bank's community, is not at all affected, diminished. On the contrary, as Agustín said, we are determined to take the opportunity of a good crisis. It's a very bad crisis, but we will take its opportunity. And so with this hope and with this very ambitious agenda, each of you made 4 priorities, multiplied by 4 and my 5, it could be 20 priorities, but there are many things in common. The BIS will make the wrap-up. Luis, I give you back the floor, and I thank again warmly each of you.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you also for the distinguished panelists for this very, very, very inspiring discussion. This brings us to the end of the Green Swan 2022 conference. I would like to thank, of course, all the speakers, but also all of you in the audience, our colleagues at the PBOC, the ECB, the NGFS, and of course here at the BIS, who work very hard in organizing this conference. I would like to thank again all of you and see you in the next Green Swan conference. Goodbye.